All right, folks. I do believe that we are live here at Esoterica with a good friend of mine, a good friend of the channel, and a scholar I really appreciate a lot, the modern Hermeticist, Dan Atrell. Thank you, Dan, for taking some time this afternoon to come on here to Esoterica and hang out, answer some questions, and talk about things we love, weird things we love.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Justin. I'm really happy to be here and longtime fan of the show, I think, since the very beginning. And I think this is our second time talking, though without a subject set necessarily today, but that's okay. There's plenty still to talk about. And so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Dan. I run the Modern Hermeticist YouTube channel. And I'm a scholar of Western esotericism, much like Dr. Sledge here. And I also tend to specialize on translations these days, translations from Latin texts. So I did the Pico not long ago. I think, I started in 2011, 2012-ish. Published that in 2019. And then since then, I've been working on Marsilio Ficino's De Christiana Religione, which I'm pleased to announce is in the proof stage. So it's finally, it's just being indexed, and then it's off to the presses to be printed. So we're in the final stages there. And I'm also working for Brepols on the Hermes Latinus series, or rather an English version of a text or collection of texts that are in the Hermes Latinus series. I think I went on Glitch Bottle podcast not too long ago to talk about that. So if you're interested in that project, you can go and check out that interview. But that's more or less what I've been doing lately. But I also have a dissertation in the works, and that is on Platonism and the Latin polemical tradition, specifically the philosophical works of polemicists, and theological works of converso polemicists often, and their influence on Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino. So my real area of interest these days is the Renaissance, but I'm also interested in all elements of history, all time periods. But really my doctoral focus is on the Renaissance and the medieval period leading up to it. So yeah, that's about it about me. And I'm happy to be on Esoterica.
Yeah. And like folks may know this, Dan and I had, it was like a 3.5 hour long marathon conversation. We really plowed deep into some pretty technical stuff. I have to say that's one of my favorite conversations I've been in a long time. That was both. I think sometimes those really long conversations can feel rather superficial, but I felt like we really drilled down into some good stuff, and I really appreciated that conversation, and it was a great way to kick off in a lot of ways the sort of very beginning of the channel and getting to know people in the community. So I really appreciate that, Dan. Folks who, if you've not clicked over to Dan's channel, the Modern Hermeticist, there is some excellent material there. You definitely want to subscribe and support Dan's work. Some really great audiobooks. That's another thing I really appreciate about your work. Like from just reading out loud some of these classical texts that we have. So I really appreciate that as well. So folks, definitely make sure to go check out the Modern Hermeticist. And also I'd like to just point out in the chat that Angela's here. Angela from Angela's Symposium.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, Angela's.
Hi, Angela.
Yeah, Angela's great. Angela's going to be on in a couple weeks, next week maybe. So I'm going to try to start doing a lot more of these live streams for folks so we can, build a community and have conversations. This kind of thing that we all like to do. And since we're all mostly disconnected by lots and lots of miles, it's great to be able to click on a button and chat and hang out. So I guess one of the questions I was going to start off with, Dan, is for a question for you. What does the translation process look like when by the time people get in their hands a copy of the Picatrix or some of the texts you're going to work with from the Hermes Trismegistus to show in Latin? Most people don't see sort of the background of what goes into that. And I think every translator does things very differently. I've translated some stuff. and you work with a team of folks, David Pareca and some other folks that are working in the translation world. What does a daily life and the work of a person translating Hermetica? What does that look like aside from doing some heavy lifts in the back?
Well, I suppose, speaking of heavy lifting, a lot of translation work is kind of front-ended in the sense that you need the training really to do it.
Right.
And that was just school and time and, what would I call it? Time under tension, where you want to have a lot of volume and you want to have a lot of time spent reading, and it doesn't really matter what you're reading necessarily. What matters is that every day you're reading in that language and you're creating those neural networks and really reinforcing forms and idioms and things like that. So that's what the background work looks like, is really like getting a lot of training. But even then, no matter how much you learn, you're never going to not go forward without the help of a dictionary or many dictionaries. So we avail ourselves. And again, I work usually with a team because, 3 heads are better than one. Especially when it comes to translating. And a lot of what our translation is doing is like arguing with each other over what stuff means. And we have very different backgrounds as translators, me and Brett Bartlett and David Pareca, who I did the Ficino and the Hermetica stuff with. And I also did the Pico with David. But a lot of it is one person coming up with a rough draft and then the rest of us nitpicking every single little point of grammar and trying to see if we can read it differently, or sometimes we might have to cover up that sentence and then retranslate it ourselves to see, the Septuagint method, as I like to call it. So there are a bunch of different strategies, but a lot of them involve coming up with a rough draft and then really working on the points of detail as you go. But the basics of translation, you learn that through practice and through doing exercises in school and writing exams and reading the classics and that sort of thing. But, you, like I was saying, you need a good lexicon. So one of the things that we've been using a lot of is the Thomas Aquinas lexicon, which I recall you mentioned on the last stream with Zevi and Philip.
Yep.
And
that's the one I use when I work in medieval, like whether it's Duns Scotus or whatever, just because there's, the essay, the entries on essay are ends. 16 pages long. It's just I couldn't get along without something like that.
Yeah, Intellectus also has I think 15 definitions, or Spirit has 15 definitions, and then it gives you every instance that it's used.
Yeah, right. So you can see the whole phrase in which it's used, and all those phrases are actual. At least in my experience, the whole phrases are technical delineations. Because medieval Latin is such a hamstrung language in many ways, vocabulary-wise, that they just have to really use it. Hebrew is even worse in that regard, by the way, for philosophy. My God. But yeah, that little lexicon is...
I do have issues with it, though. Like I noticed, because when you're working with a lot of dictionaries, you end up looking up the word in multiple dictionaries. And I noticed that like a lot of the definitions in that one are almost like copy-pasted out of Lewis and Short, which is like fine, but you would think that there would be a lot more nuance in the shift of the word from the classical to the medieval period, and that Aquinas wasn't necessarily using the same definitions as people were using in the ancient world. And in any case, you won't get the use cases for the classical world in the Thomas Aquinas dictionary.
Right.
So yeah. And then it becomes tricky too, because when you're translating Renaissance people, these are people who are trying to bring back good Latinity.
Right.
And they are trying to to use words in the way that they were used in antiquity by ancient authors. And sometimes they just, you can't tell necessarily if they're trying to use the word in the old sense or in the new sense, like in the medieval sense or in...
It's funny, old and new in that regard.
Yes.
Yeah. And one of your people on your team is a classicist, right? It's like a...
we're all classicists.
All classicists. Okay. So is anyone,
Yeah.
is anyone there like not just but really specializing in like medieval Latinity? Or is it...
Well, so...
Because I can imagine classicists being run crazy. Like, you guys just must be masochists.
Okay, so it's complicated because I mean it's not that complicated. Brett has a master's in classics.
Mm-hmm.
I have a master's in classics, and I'm doing my PhD in medieval studies.
Okay. Yeah.
And David Pareca has his PhD in medieval studies at the Warburg Institute, but is the head of the classics department at the University of Waterloo currently.
Right. Gotcha.
And so it's like, are we classicists? Are we medievalists? I can tell you one thing, that Brett Bartlett is not a medievalist, and we have to carry him kicking and screaming through translating the Book of 24 Philosophers and the commentaries, because the Latin is garbage.
Yeah, the Latin. It's funny because it has all those really famous medieval... God is a circumference for whom the whatever the thing is here and the thing is nowhere. Although it has a lot of those. I think the origin of a lot of those famous things is there. But yeah, the Latin is just like, when it's the text that I think of when you think of humanists making fun of medieval Latin.
It very much is that.
Yeah.
And maybe not so much the aphorisms themselves, which those are okay. Like, they're a bit turgid at times, but what's really turgid is the scholastic notes on the Book of 24 Philosophers. Yeah. And so there's Glossator A and Glossator B, and they are both, sloppy quoters, bad Latin. Like, every time they quote another author, they're not actually like copying out what he said. They're just recalling it from memory and very rarely getting it right. And there's just certain sentences that you can't translate. Like, you can guess at what he meant, but you can never know for sure. And that is an extremely unsettling and frustrating thing to go through as a translator, like putting your name on something when you're like, I don't actually know for this couple of sentences or this word or how it's used or whatever. It doesn't happen terribly often, but it really is not grammatically sound in the way that classical Latin is. And even Ficino himself is not perfect either. I mean, nobody's perfect. And Ficino's a much better Latinist than I am, but I'm also trained enough to know some of the things that Ficino does, to see that his Latinity is a bit colored by medieval Latin. Mm-hmm. Nobody just sprang out of the Middle Ages with perfect Latinity.
Right. But it also it's a function of the kinds of things he's writing about too. I mean, there's no way he's going to avoid the specter of Thomas and the metaphysics that, the past 500 years of metaphysics before him.
Yeah.
So,
and the work that we translated, this pro-Christian polemic, is mostly cribbed from medieval Dominican converso authors. And so he carries that style over from them, like verbatim, because it's not necessarily plagiarism, but he's building a book from other people's ideas. He has some of his own
itself
ideas.
Very medieval.
Yeah,
it's like this, all these Lombard sentences and stuff like that. These texts that are sort of built up of other things.
Yeah, and like, books were rare and hard to get a hold of, and we welcome multiple copies or shortened versions of books or excerpts or whatever it may be. But it just makes it so that you can see a clear distinction in the Latin from the parts that are supposed to be these rhetorically, let's say, purple passages, when he's talking about Platonic wings and Phaedrus's chariot and all this and that. He's very eloquent in his Latinity. But when you get to the more theological bits where he's just quoting bits of the Bible and citing them against, I don't know, Maimonides or whoever it may be, then the Latin gets not so clear because it reverts to a medieval style.
Right. Well, yeah, I guess that's to be expected in the end. I mean, and one even wonders. Yeah, it must have been interesting just even think in their own minds with someone like Ficino having to walk back and forth and the kind of Latin he wanted to be working in, what little the classical stuff he had access to, and then the medieval stuff. I mean, I'm trying to think of something like I guess it's someone who works in early modern English, like trying if one were trying to write in early modern English sometimes. I don't know if that's a similar kind of analog where you're writing a book and something like that. I don't know what the exact analogy would be.
We had sort of things like that happened where we wanted to. So in addition, when we were translating Ficino, he published a Latin version of his book, and he also published an Italian version for more popular usage. And so sometimes when a passage was a bit obscure, we would go to the Italian version and look that up. And we had a dictionary from the 17th century that was an Italian to English dictionary. And it was actually designed by the guy who wrote it to read Ficino in Italian as an Englishman.
That's very convenient.
And so we were like, this is an awesome dictionary. Very happy to have it. And we used it quite a lot. So that was a kind of an example of trying to restore the old style of things. Another one was using the Douay-Rheims Bible. So instead of the Vulgate, or rather the Douay-Rheims is the Catholic Bible. They don't read the King James, right?
Right.
But the Douay-Rheims is based off the Vulgate. It's not based off of the Greek text by Erasmus. And so they needed to, if you want to read and understand Ficino's Bible quotes, then you need to look at him from the perspective of the Douay-Rheims Bible. And so, and then that opens up a whole can of worms because you're citing all these different Bible verses that are, kind of similar to the form that you see them in the King James Version, but just different enough. And I think a lot of people, they read NIV or ESV or New King James or King James. There's all kinds of translations people read today, but very few people read the Douay-Rheims Bible because it's just based off of the Vulgate. Right. And who wants to read like an English translation of a Latin translation of a Greek text? But you actually have to do that if you want to understand how Ficino was reading the Bible, because he was not reading the Bible in Greek, right. Which is weird. Like,
because he certainly could have been.
Yeah, we think of Ficino as this guy who was reading Greek, translating Plato, translating Corpus Hermeticum, but nevertheless,
badly translating the Corpus Hermeticum.
Yeah, or rather, translating it and then somebody publishing it without his authorization before he managed to make any changes.
Right. Yeah, that's what I think it really was. Is that he didn't. It's not so much a bad translation. It's just it was a sort of a really rough draft that. Although he just leaves out entire sentences and stuff. It is interesting looking at the manuscript that he was working from and just looking at his what ended up in the actual translation. So, which is funny because that translation had such legs. I have a copy from the 17th century over there with his short commentary, and it just got reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. So,
which is funny because like the Ludovico Lazzarelli version is much better.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And that's the version that Agrippa used. Mm-hmm. And nobody talks about it.
Yeah, the Lazzarelli, and it's complete too, or complete is whatever. It's all 17, as opposed to just the 14 or whatever that Ficino translated. But that one. It's even the Lazzarelli version. I think it's just an artifact of how famous Ficino was, and also that Lazzarelli, that one edition that whatever that got printed was not printed in many numbers, and Lazzarelli I think he was looked at as a fringe character because of his support of the crazy preacher
Mercurio.
Mercurio. Yeah, the crazy preacher guy. I think a lot of people are, I think people kind of looked askew at Lazzarelli. Also, I wonder why in the world Lazzarelli attached himself to that guy in the way that he did.
If he was even real.
Yeah, there's that debate. I think he was.
He probably was.
Yeah, I think he probably. I mean, there's so many accounts that line up that are similar enough from people who have no, because it's weird because Lazzarelli really clings to him, and most of the people that write about him are like, yeah, there was a whack job that was roaming around Florence with his family and poverty or whatever. But that's another question I want to get to today too, if you don't mind it, is I want to get your read on the Cathar question.
I feel like my opinion on the Cathar question is not as valuable probably as yours, having done a lot more research in it. Like, I've read the classics like Montagu and A Persecuting Society by R.I. Moore and Righteous Persecution and these kinds of important works of medieval scholarship. And I think most of them they take for granted that it's a real thing and that there's a real controversy. But I suspect that so I would say for sure the Augustinian, the fact that the Dominicans are an Augustinian order and that they are very well versed in Augustinian literature from Augustine, like the Confessions and things like this. This is well-known literature. And the way that Augustine describes the Manichaeans in the Confessions, they, I think, projected some of that onto people and went looking for basically Manichaeans and found Manichaeans in their minds, but not in actuality. They just simplified what a Manichaean was or projected it. And I think that's a lot of what people do today when they call them Gnostics, or when they say, like, they might be the descendants of the Bogomil movement, but we don't really know. We're only saying that we know that through an analogy of their beliefs, but there are all kinds of dualist religions that are, independent from one another, that don't need to be connected by some kind of tradition. And I really do think that a lot of the Cathar stuff is like witchcraft in the sense that it's not necessarily real beliefs, but beliefs that people were forced to admit to under torture because they were being asked those questions, which were being guided by preconceived notions that came down from heresiological literature, like Irenaeus and Aquinas and the whole lot. So I do think that there was obviously an independent or different form of Christianity. They're everywhere, right? Like,
the Middle Ages is full of those. I mean,
even today, Syrian Orthodox, two different, maybe three different kinds of Russian Orthodox, Coptic, Greek, Latin, Protestant, a million kinds of Protestant, Jehovah's Witness.
Right. The Arians invited the Muslims into Spain basically to defend them against the Catholics. There was an Arian tradition that lasted in Spain for quite some time, all the way up, maybe even into the Muslim period. So there were certainly Pelagians and all kinds of Donatists and all kinds of things that were sort of lingering around in Gaul and Spain. Even into the High Middle Ages.
I think this is one of the most common misconceptions that people have about the Middle Ages, is that either Islam in the Islamic world or Islamicate world and Christianity in the West were hegemonic. They were in some sense, but the power tendrils were not as thorough as they are today, where everything is heavily scrutinized and broadcasted and filmed and recorded and so on and so forth.
And this is one of the things I mention when I always talk about the Cathars, is that if they did exist, which I tend to be more skeptical, I tend to be skeptical of that. But what certainly terrified the church was the fact that people like the Dominicans, they had just had to deal with the Dominicans and the whole question of apostolic poverty. And then on the heels of the Dominicans comes the Waldensians, and there's this huge movement in the church, and beginning early on in the 11th century, 12th century, that terrified the institutional church. like they're like, whatever, metaphysical dualism, whatever. That might be out there and it might be a worrying thing, but the church lives and dies on apostolic. If this apostolic poverty thing becomes a widespread, large movement, like it was becoming with the Dominicans, and we can't control it, then our our ability to control all these massive plantations in France goes away. And that was, I think, much more, insofar as they were attacking with the veracity they were, the Cathars and the Waldensians, it was really as a part of a squash on controlling apostolic poverty.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
So in my work, I follow closely the work of Herbert Grundmann, who wrote extensively on this topic. And his argument in a book called The Religious Movements of the Middle Ages, which is excellent. It's translated from the German into English by, I think, Robert E. Lerner. And it argues that there weren't many poverty movements in the Middle Ages. There was actually just one giant movement.
Yeah.
And this kind of goes, it speaks a little bit to this idea of the Cathar heresy, in that they practiced the kinds of things that were popular among other, let's say, heretically poor groups, whether, the Waldensians, the Humiliati, the Catholic poor, the Beguines, the Begards. And then what happened was the church wanted to fight the enemy using their own weapons. And one of the things they did for that was they took in the group led by St. Francis of Assisi, who was leading a group of basically apostolically poor renunciates. He was the son of a wealthy cloth merchant, gave up that life, stripped himself naked in the street, and started to renounce property, because he felt that this is what the apostles and what Christ did when they lived here. It said, don't carry a walking stick, don't think about money, just consider the lilies, God will take care of you. And so they became dedicated instead to living among lepers and prostitutes, and trying to heal and convert them. And the difference between Peter Waldo from the Waldensians and Francis was that Francis submitted to the church.
Right.
And the Pope essentially believed that they could take in Francis and also Dominic over in France, or Spain, I guess, France, Spain-ish area. He was all over the place at that time, just preaching to various groups. But they were submitted, and they became orders. And from that point on, you needed papal approval to make your own order, and there would be no more orders. There were eventually, but they made it a rule that only this group would have the orders. And what that did was it allowed an outlet for people to practice apostolic poverty without demanding it from the church.
Right. Yeah, that was the solution. Quarantined it, basically.
Yes. And they were you can be poor and you just join this group or this group.
Yep.
And they have their own rules. They have so the Franciscan they had to make their own rules. The Dominicans, they followed the Augustinian rule that had already been around for some time.
Even with the Waldensians, folks that were converted over from people that were converts from Waldensians back in, and the Catholics let them invent the poor Catholics.
Yeah.
They're like, yeah, as long as they quarantine your poverty and don't insist that our bishops be poor, fine.
Yeah, because they knew that wisely that if they all took up, yeah,
it was a brilliant counterinsurgency. I mean, it's sort of the lesson of counterinsurgency. You recognize the actual wants of your opponents and you give it to them, but you just quarantine the impact.
Yeah. And so also when you're sending people against the Cathars, you can say, like, you can't accuse us of not being vegetarian, for example. You can't accuse us of wearing robes and jewelry and having gold adornments on things like that. Like, you can accuse us of none of that because we live humbly like the apostles did.
All right. And I think that's a real secret weapon against the Cathar movement. Is that they robbed the Waldensians and the Christian dualists or Cathars of the main thing that really made the movements popular, which was their critique of how rich all those bishops and stuff were.
Right.
And so you're like, yeah, we're not. And the Inquisitioners that are torturing you, just as poor as you are. In fact, in fact, you should have converted to us. Like we've heard your critiques and we've done what you wanted. Why? And so you're enduring in your heresy, as opposed to, it's like you're, what is it? A recalcitrant heretic.
Yeah.
So.
And there's like a razor thin distinction between, someone who is apostolically poor and someone who is heretically poor.
Yeah.
And it was
institutional backing.
Yeah, and this is where you get the fraction within the Franciscan order between the conventuals and the spirituals.
Mm-hmm.
And now these aren't formal orders. It's just a way to distinguish between people who, let's say, follow the rules and or let's say allowed the rules to be softened a little bit and then followed those rules. And then there were other people who said the rules cannot be softened. Right. The last will and testament of Francis is divine scripture, and it needs to be adhered to as sacred scripture. It cannot be altered, and we have to follow it to the law. And anybody who says otherwise is the Antichrist.
Right. Oh yeah, it's amazing. I mean, even seeing like down to like how they could move blind people from monastery to monastery. And they bragged about how the blind could be moved from one monastery to the other and didn't have to have a walking stick inside the monastery because they knew immediately where everything was. And like seeing some of the outlines of the monasteries and how exacting they are all over Europe is amazing. Just want to point out that Derek from Myth Vision podcast, who is a channel I really like and I've been on several times, is given 2 super chats, and appreciate that, Derek. He's a really great guy doing the really cool work of taking in scholars like Bart Ehrman and other folks and really making them accessible so that regular common folks on the internet can just like ask Bart Ehrman a question about whatever's like bothering them, or so all these cool scholars that come in, and it's a really cool platform to host. I'm trying to think of Elaine Pagels or something. And if you just happen to have a pet question that you want to ask Elaine Pagels, you just sign on to the live stream and you get access to it. I think it's a really cool, because it means that academics don't have to start their own YouTube channels and can rely on folks who are doing really cool work like Derek to kind of get plugged into that. So it'd be cool to bring on Richard Kiekeffer or Walter Hanegraaff, because I don't think Richard Kiekeffer is ever going to start his own YouTube channel. But he might be willing to sit down. I don't think so. But he might be willing to sit down and ask, people can pick his brain about the clerical necromantic underground. He can be thanked for having invented that phrase, I think.
I mean, Kalamazoo is going on right now, or was last week, the conference for medieval studies.
Oh, yeah.
And that's been online for, I think, the last 2 years now. I didn't go this year because it was online, and I'm just so...
You're knee deep
zoomed out of meetings and stuff like that. But in terms of, like all those scholars all know how to use webcams and have microphone access because I saw them all at the conferences.
Yep. There's no reason why they can't say no for technical reasons.
Yeah.
But yeah, Derek has a question on a super chat, and I think we could probably answer it as much as So what are the differences between the Cathars, the Waldensians, the Albigensians, which I think that there may be overlap there.
Yeah.
And comment on fun heretical sects not much mentioned in church history. So you want to grab it? You want to?
Sure.
I guess I could say that the Cathars and the Albigensians are basically the same thing, at least in that typically the word Cathar actually isn't used of them at that time. It's only very rarely applied to them. They typically get called Manichaeans, actually. And then second to the Manichaeans, they're typically called Albigensians, which is just a term for the region. But generally speaking, these are Christian dualists that in the mind of the Inquisitors operated as sort of counter church. And their theology is basically eventually became a kind of bitheism in which the God and the devil were distinct dualistic pairs locked in combat. And that Christ did not come to this physical earth, but rather came to a different dimension, was incarnated in a different dimension. There's differences between the various things that people were tortured into saying. And that basically what you have in the Cathar church, much as there was one, was a kind of dualism, of metaphysical dualism and a commitment to apostolic poverty. Also, they eliminated all of the sacraments with the exception of one called the consolamentum, which was a laying on of hands ritual that both initiated people into the order, made them into perfecti or perfecti. There were women allegedly perfecti. We don't know much about them, but allegedly there were some. And you were expected to remain sinless the entire time that you were a member of the perfecti. And if you, this is also an interesting thing too, I was reading about, that if you were a perfecti and you committed a sin, all of the other perfecti that you made were de-perfectified.
Oof.
This is, and this goes back to the old problem of Donatism back in the day, in Augustine's day. And of course, they solved that. At least Augustine solved the problem of Donatism. The ethical compunction of the priest doesn't matter in terms of the sacraments, but apparently the Cathars said it did. And so, but anyway, so you would have the perfecti, and basically what you have was at the end of your life, if you were just a normal Cathar believer, a good Christian, you would be given the consolamentum, and then you would be allowed to escape the physical world and go into the world of Christ. You want to handle the Waldensians?
Sure.
Where's Waldo?
So yeah, and that is actually where's Waldo come
because they hunted them down. So yeah, where's Waldo?
So if I'm not mistaken, the Waldensians are from southern France, right, or like northern Italy, southern France-ish area. And they were a movement of, my cat is screaming. Sorry. They were a movement bent on apostolic poverty, firstly, and secondly, on lay preaching. And that's what really got them in trouble, was that they were very interested in reading the Bible themselves and interpreting the Bible themselves and preaching it to whoever would listen, mainly city dwellers, poor people, often, again, lepers, prostitutes, and Jews are the three main groups of outcasts in Christian society that these kinds of preachers would try to preach to. And with Peter Waldo, this is actually something that ended up getting corrected with the preachers of the Franciscan and the Dominican order, is that they could be ordained to preach. And so they could practice apostolic poverty like the Waldensians, but unlike the Waldensians, they were allowed to preach because they were ordained, given the training. And this is part of the reason why you see so many mendicants in the 13th century entering into the university system, becoming trained debaters, rhetoricians, getting very good at grammar, because it's all to be used in the service of a culture of debate. Right. And because to debate somebody is to convince somebody, and to convince somebody is to convert them. And so, yeah, that's the Waldensians for you in brief. There's actually a lot written about them.
And they survived.
Yes,
they managed to make it basically into the mountains of Italy and escape the Inquisition. Unlike the Cathars, who were, insofar as they did exist, were ruthlessly exterminated. I mean, the massacres at Béziers and stuff like that were just nightmarish. But the Waldensians survived to this day. They're still. So they did manage to hold out, which is also, I think, more evidence to say that the Cathars may have not existed the way the way that Bernard Guy or someone said they did, because they could have survived. They would have, if they were out there, they would have probably mimicked the Waldensians, and the Waldensians survived in huge numbers, actually, which is very impressive.
Yeah, they played a big role in the Reformation.
Right. Which is also to your point of how the Catholic Church did not have that kind of hegemony that people think it did. That they could massacre a bunch of people in a big city where there are population centers, but they really weren't going to send Rambo the Inquisitioner out to the forest and mountains of Italy to track down, even these relatively substantial Waldensian communities. At some point, it was just too hard to do it, and I think that once they extirpated the kind of heresies that they were worried about in the major population centers, they didn't really care.
Once they got their land,
once they got their land. And I think once the lords, more importantly, once the lords that were granted inquisitional and military power to do the actual crusading, and again, most of these guys are veterans of the Fourth Crusade who are perfectly used to killing Christians. Which people, it's one of those funny things that I think people forget. The Fourth Crusade was basically just an attack on Constantinople to pay for the Third. These people were very accustomed to killing Christians. And so once they were done doing that, you know, the lords had no interest in sending their resources out to the mountains of Italy to try to find these people, because they had their lands and they were done. It was more than enough.
Yeah, and I feel like the conquest of the New World was in some way a lot like that as well, where you had this martial culture in place of crusaders and of of warriors who are basically looking for adventure and money and gold, and
Right.
no good comes of that. But that's definitely something that was often around. There were spare swords laying around, and
I'm sure.
you can find some way to motivate them.
Oh, right. I mean, that's the upside and downside of medieval primogeniture, right? Is that it sort of prevented the kind of breakdown you had in after Charlemagne died, but then it causes all those second, third, fourth, fifth sons. They got to do something, and they're all this knightly class, and I even think at some point that the Crusades were just a part of it, at least, that was just sort of exporting the violence out of Europe, just like get it to go somewhere else, send all those third and fourth sons. Because if it really motivated by taking the Holy Land back from the Muslims or whatever, the Saracens, they could have done that 600 years prior. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that Europe had a massive violence problem, and exporting it was one solution to it. Favorite heresy? Any fun heresies that don't get a lot of air?
Have you ever read The Cheese and the Worms by Carlos Ginzburg?
Yeah.
So that book is really fascinating, because what it is a window into is the fact that there are idiosyncratic heresies that are not actually groups of people that believe in anything. They're not cults or survivals or anything like that. There are literally just some eccentric individuals in the world who make up their own cosmologies. And my favorite analogy for this in the modern world is Time Cube. Because Time Cube is not adjacent to anything. It's not it's not part of anything. And anybody who came along and tried to become part of it got violently rejected by Jean Ray, the owner, and was like, there's no Time Cube prophecies. I'm sorry. Like, there's no such thing. This is all nonsense. You need to stop saying that you're preaching the Time Cube or whatever it may be. And so there were people like this in the Middle Ages who had their own personal view of the world. And in terms of this guy in this book, The Cheese and the Worms, it was that the universe was spontaneously generated, like maggots or flies in cheese, because they had a theory of spontaneous generation at the time. They didn't
love the stuff about the honey inside of lions, which is a really great one. Yeah.
And so to him, the universe kind of just sprang into existence like this, and he was persecuted by the Inquisitors. And now what does that look like? It's, somebody comes and knocks on your door and checks your beliefs, and they do that, many, many times over before they finally say, like, okay, we're going to bring this guy in. And then they punished him, made him wear a hair shirt in some sort of like permanent penitential act, and sent him on his way. And he was in and out of this punishment over and over again, because, it's one thing to have these beliefs. It's another to be brought in by the authorities and then corrected, and to say, no, I still actually believe that the universe spontaneously generated like cheese and worms. And
it's funny what you double down on.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm about the cheese and the worms thing, for real, guys.
And so no matter how much we want to talk about different heretical groups or unique heretical groups, it's also interesting to think that there are so many individual heretics who fell through the cracks, and whose stories we don't actually necessarily know. But they were idiosyncratic mystics or whatever that may be.
And it's interesting to me who gets in trouble and who doesn't. I think of someone like, I don't know, Marguerite Perret. Like, had she been a man, maybe she wouldn't have, and maybe had she not doubled down in the way that she did, she may have escaped the punishment she got. But like, when I look at Joachim Fiore, of all the people that, like, I look at his writings, think, this guy, how did he not get, like, in some kind of...
I mean, he did after.
He did after, yeah. But I mean, even in his lifetime, he's writing this stuff, publishing it. And it's just like...
He was friend of popes.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that helped sometimes.
He was friend of multiple popes and kings, and he also was kicked out of the Cistercian order.
Right, but
because
that's not
he was
hard,
a
though,
renegade.
It's not hard to be a renegade in the Cistercians.
Yeah, so he was like, I'm leaving this order. You guys are too soft. I'm way harder than you guys. I'm going to climb a mountain and found my own order. And they're like, okay, you're a renegade. And like, basically, you're kicked out. They don't have the power to excommunicate him, but they can definitely express their dissatisfaction with liturgical curses and things like that.
Right. Yeah, I find that to be that kind of stuff to be super fascinating. Like, who doesn't get in trouble and who does. Again, the Beguines and the Macards. I think that they would have never gotten into the kind of trouble that they did, weren't for the poverty business. I think that if they had just been like, no, just wear nice clothes, just don't bother us about that, I think they'd have been fine.
And that's where the Dominicans come into play, really, because they were used to keep tabs on different beguinages. So, every, let's say, month or two, Fra Girolamo would walk into your town and keep tabs on everything, make sure that your organization really is not preaching apostolic poverty as a heresy. You can be poor, and that's a big source of the history of hospitals. From the Hôtel Dieu, these are like beguine houses that take care of lepers and travelers and other injured and sick people. And often they had oversight from Dominican friars or later on Jesuits.
Right.
That's
and it's funny also when some of those Dominicans kind of go native, so to speak, like Meister Eckhart. He's in many ways he sort of adopts a lot of those theologies, and of course that gets him into his own spell of trouble. I guess he's lucky he died when he did. We're lucky too, because although I wouldn't have all the stuff that he did, but I think he also kind of went native with the Beguines and the Bacards, and unfortunately paid the price for it. Trying to think if there are any other like little heresies or whatever that I think are interesting from antiquity. There's a long list of them in Irenaeus and stuff. None of those are really jumping out. Boerites or whatever. I think one thing I do think is interesting to think about some of these heresies is that I think there was a whole generation beginning in maybe the early 20th century that just wrote off a lot of the more weird stuff that allegedly they believed. Like the Carbocratians are the people that are coming to mind with their sexual stuff. And I like how April DeConnick
the spermophages, the fetophages.
Yeah, the eating babies and stuff, and all the kind of stuff that's eventually going to be put on the Cathars and the witches and whatever, the Jews. But what I think is interesting about Carbocratians is that Hippolytus has this funny incident where he talks about being initiated into their order, and they were going to do some sexual thing, and everyone started getting naked, and he freaked out and ran away. And then he ratted out several people who were allegedly other Carbocratians who were also Orthodox, and they got in trouble. He got these people in trouble. And it's interesting you have these little vignettes into that world. And there was a whole generation of scholarship that just said, no, none of this stuff is true. It's just crazy. Hippolytus and Irenaeus just exaggerated all this stuff, and none of it's actually reliable. And I do tend to agree with April DeConnick that when we get those firsthand accounts from people like Hippolytus, or Hippolytus, however you pronounce his name, I tend to be a little bit more willing to believe that he did experience something, that he was a little closer to those movements because I think that often the people who become the most virulent anti-heresy people are the people for whom their origin or previous mistakes mean they have to sort of like overdo it. And I think that's true with a lot of the folks that you study, like Heresies and Flavius and Thucydides, that they're converted Jews who just can't be regular everyday converts. They have to double down and really show how they've abandoned Judaism, and they'll turn on Judaism and use the weapons of Judaism against Judaism. And they have to really double down on being not just conversos, but anti-Jewish. Yeah. And I think that's when I see in Hippolytus and other people like that, who this hardcore anti-heresiological trait, it's the, thou dost protest too much. I think that they were probably closer to it than I think they were closer to it. And I think that stuff maybe have been more real than a previous generation of scholarship was willing to admit. So maybe Carbocratians or something like that.
Yeah. Signaling good faith is, or bona fides is one of the three essential components of what I call the Latin polemical tradition. And I mean, it may be part of other polemical traditions, but it is very an obvious aspect of the Latin polemical tradition. And that is, you appeal to a higher intellect, to the spiritual intellect. You battle the enemy with their own weapons.
Right.
And you do so not to convert people, but to prove your own good faith. Because, for a lot of, let's say, Dominican and Franciscans, they who were sent to preach to Jews, they believed that Jews would just convert at the end of time anyways.
Right.
Like, it just happens at the final moment of history. So you don't have to individually convert everybody. You need to work on your own caritas, your own merit, and you can have the ultimate merit by achieving martyrdom during preaching. But it's very seldom that you see people preaching in order actually to convert other people, especially when it's writing these polemics.
Right.
So yeah, Flavius Mithridates, he was interesting because he wrote about kind of this substratum that Judaism and Christianity and paganism all came out of together. So he wasn't dealing with them in kind of parallel tracks like a lot of other people did. And I think the reason he did this was because as a convert, he couldn't preach something that Pico would preach, that is that Christians need to be converted to Kabbalah. Right. Because if Flavius Mithridates came out and said,
he would be before the Inquisition that day.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's no way in hell he's going to go away with that. No, God, no. Yeah.
So when he's called to speak in front of the Pope, he has to use Raymond Marty's Pugio Fidei in his sermon on the Passion of the Lord. That's the name of the work. And he draws extensively from this Spanish anti-Jewish polemical work. And again, he's not saying this is how we convert anybody. He's just trying to demonstrate, like, I know the system, here's how it works, and I know how the interpretation of history is, and so on and so forth. And again, like, that was, I think, in 1482, and by 1488 he was on the run again. We don't know why.
Right, he's
possibly sort of had something to do with pedophilia.
Yeah, there's all the accusations of that he's Flavius Mithridates is a weird dude.
He was definitely a weird dude.
Yeah, this one of these characters only the Renaissance could produce. Like, I don't know, there's like a stock of those characters that I just wish that there was infinite budget to make Netflix shows, so I could just make a Pico show. Yeah, if I were a billionaire, I would just be like, all right, there's going to be a Pico show. There's going to be a Pico movie. There's going to be a John Dee movie. We're going to spend a bunch of money on outfits. It's going to be great.
I watched one of not the Medici one. That one was too awful to watch. The Borgia show. The
Borgias, yeah.
And that one I liked a little bit, and but it didn't have any Ficino and it didn't have any Pico, and I was like, what a loss.
Machiavelli was in it, right? Was it Machiavelli?
Was he? Maybe as like a young guy, or like some sort of foreshadowing.
I think he was. Maybe it was in the Medici one that he was in. He's just a sort of minor character, though, and he would have been uninteresting at the end of the day. I mean, philosophers don't lead terribly interesting lives, but
they could have had like some lip service at least, like Pope Borgia lifting the excommunication on Pico della Mirandola or something like that.
Something, yeah. And it's just he's like, and it's not like he's a marginal character in Renaissance history. And it's not also like he doesn't make good storytelling. I mean, he's probably he's maybe one of the most. I mean, his whole life and death, and you can easily imagine, like, I don't know, young Leonardo DiCaprio playing Pico and getting
definitely
something. Yeah, so
though he's horribly misunderstood.
Pico?
Very popular, but terribly misunderstood, because all the scholarship on him up until like a decade and a half ago. Until Gershom Scholem, Chaim Wierzbicki, and Moshe Idel got to Pico, people did not have any idea what was going on.
The Kabbalistic theses are, unless you are really versed in the world of Renaissance Kabbalah, like that weird intersection of Alameno and Flavius Mithridates, because even the Kabbalah he's dealing with is almost idiosyncratic to that clique of people. So yeah, I mean, I guess the only book I've read recently is the Syncretism of the West book. I think that's the one, right? That's the,
Yeah. I mean, that's the one that has the conclusions. And I think Brian Copenhaver is working on a new edition. Like, he just published a new edition of, okay, so he has a new book called Magic and the Dignity of Man,
right.
which is all about rescuing Pico's image from basically the idea that Pico is firstly all about dignity, the dignity of man, which is actually like a Kantian idea that was retrojected on him.
Right.
And then there is magic, where everybody thinks Pico is interested in magic, and actually Pico is kind of anti-magic, and definitely anti-astrology.
Oh yeah, who heard a whole book about that?
And you know, the magic and astrology, they go together quite a bit at this time period.
Right.
And so he reconceptualizes a lot of the study of Pico, but at the back in the index of that book, he has a new edition of the Oration, which is great, because I think that Brian Copenhaver is probably one of the first people to read the Oration without like messing it up or getting the emphasis in the wrong place.
Oh, right. The reading the Oration, I mean, I was taught the Oration by itself. I'm an undergraduate reading it, and sort of, it's like the one thing of Renaissance philosophy you read. And I'm like, yeah, amputated from its context, this makes you actually read it completely backwards in many ways.
Yeah.
What makes man dignified or special is not Renaissance values. It's this, Kabbalistic.
Yeah.
It's a completely different than reading it as a proto-Kantian work is not the thing to do.
It's not. Yeah. It's opposite to dignity in the Kantian sense, because what it's ultimately about is self-annihilation and angelomorphosis and unity with the one. So it's this kind of like Averroan union with the active intellect, disintegration of the self into the good, and that of course is good. Like that is the ultimate highest
by
good.
definition.
Yeah, and to seek anything other than that is bad, is a lesser good, and therefore is deficient. So, and not only that, but it's clear that Pico is saying in the Oration that dignity in the Kantian sense is universal and applicable to all men, and it is inalienable, and it is something that is inborn, and none of those things, according to Brian Copenhaver, are in Pico's idea of dignity. And in any case, the sense that dignity is used is rank, not so if you have dignity, you're not a slave, for example. You can lose your dignity by becoming a slave. That's not the idea of dignity in the Kantian sense, which again is something intrinsic.
Right, and that's how it's taught. And basically, Pico is taught as sort of at least that's how I was taught him, as a proto-Kantian. And I was like, no, I don't think this makes sense with the rest of it.
Yeah, and he's also made to be a proto-existentialist by Guérin and all of these Italians in the early 20th century who are reading Pico as a kind of forerunner to their own belief systems, and as an existentialist, and that's also impossible. You can't really read Pico properly and think of him as an existentialist.
This is a common thing that philosophers do, right? It was like the amount of Spinozas out there now, like everybody's like, there was the 70s and 80s was spent by philosophers grabbing at Spinoza and making him into a proto-communist or whatever they wanted him to be.
Yeah.
I'm like, you can't do that. That's weird. I mean, you can, I guess, but you just systematically misread people.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't know.
What Pico is ultimately is an Aristotelian who tackles Platonic problems and uses Kabbalah to solve them.
Yeah.
That's I think the best way. You can't call him a Platonist necessarily. You don't really call him a Kabbalist. You don't really call him but he was an Aristotelian schoolman, studied, with Elia del Medico, lots of Averroist stuff, and then used, and again, he wasn't syncretizing anything. I take issue with this idea of syncretizing. What he was doing was finding the best.
Right.
Which is not saying what you have is what I have, and we both call it different things. It's saying like what you have is wrong and what I have is right, and like everybody should believe what I have.
No, for sure. I mean, that's what nearly got him killed. Yeah, he's not. Yeah, and he's not syncretizing, because I think that's what's another thing that has to be understood about the conclusions. Is that's what we have, are conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
That he's, when he has the Aravaristic conclusions, he's not deducing. It's not a Hegelian thing. He's not deducing.
Yeah.
He's not telling you the process of deduction. He's telling you what is true.
And he was going to debate those points.
Oh yeah, he was.
So those are like points for debate, where it's like we can't know, unless you've been like studying Pico really intensely for decades, what it is exactly he had in his mind to be able to respond to this debate. But in his mind, he had the system in place, and he's like, I can use any part of this to undo any other part. So any objections that anybody raises, I will point them to, section 7, subsection 11, or whatever. Right.
It would have been, again, this is the kind of thing that if I could make a show, it would be so great to have seen what that would have looked like.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing the amount of people that challenged the Pope and the Pope died. I like that is a thing that happens in history at least a couple times.
Yeah, like Abulafia.
Abulafia, yeah. Abulafia and Pico both just managed, like, the lucky death of the Pope is saved not a couple of weirdos in the Middle Ages. I really like that happened twice at least.
You would think they'd start picking young popes in order to get around this problem, so that they could have these really long terms. And
no, it's true. And it was Galileo. I mean, it also with I always imagine what would have happened if Galileo didn't know whatever Pope Alexander or whatever, how fast that would have gone south for him. Maybe he wouldn't have dug in so hard. But it was also interesting, just even with the Pope as like your really good friend, seeing that even Galileo could not escape the clutches of the Inquisition in that way. He's lucky he got what he got. All right, let me jump over here and grab some questions. I know that some folks are definitely putting them in the chat, so I want to see if we can make sure to get a couple that I think we can answer. Sometimes people ask questions that are completely unanswerable, like, I don't know, which Sephiroth would you be? Maybe you have an answer to that, Dan. I don't know.
I feel it'd be presumptuous to say.
No. There we go. That's a good one for Dan. From Andrew. Andrew is the Rosh Yeshiva over at Angela Symposium. Andrew's a great guy. Really is a supporter of the channel and supporter of Angela, and he's just a really fine fellow. The question for Dan: translator from history for whom you have the most admiration. I appreciate this question because of all the people in history that get short shrift, it's translators. So many people are happy to say, "Oh, that was a terrible translation." Very rarely do we hear people go, "Oh yeah, that was an excellent translation." So, any translators that you?
I mean, the question I would ask is like, do we mean modern history, like modern translators, or like old ancient translators? In which case, I don't know. I've never really thought about this. I like you say, I don't really think about translators that much.
No, when they do their job well, they're diaphanous, right? That's the problem, is that you do your job well and you're invisible. It's only when you do your job bad that anyone knows your name. Copenhagen is a pretty good translator, I would say. In terms of like bequeathing to us, our generation of people interested in Western esotericism, I can't imagine that landscape without Copenhagen.
Yeah. I don't agree with all of his choices, which, I mean, I only know that because I've been working on a new edition of the Asclepius with a new, based on a new critical edition that he didn't have when he did his. And there are a few places where I find that he went too heavily with the French translation by what's his name?
Festugère.
Yeah, Festugère, and so where I think that's probably where a lot of disagreements between our translation and his translation happened was in those sort of spots where the Latin becomes turgid, and people, you got to take a stab at it, but sometimes you think, my stab is better than this stab, or but other than that, I absolutely am head over heels over Brian Copenhaver's work. I feel kind of like I live in his shadow in a way, because every project that I'm interested in, he's already been there and he's already done it. And not only that, but he's like revolutionized the field.
Right. No,
So
yeah.
it's like I can never write anything. It doesn't matter if it's Ficino, doesn't matter if it's Pico, doesn't matter if it is Corpus Hermeticum related stuff. He's just done all of that stuff before me, and I'm very grateful for his work.
No, that's what I'm saying. The landscape. I mean, the landscape of our work, my work is, it's not imaginable really without him. I don't know. Anyone else jump out at you, recent or ancient?
Like I'm really interested in all of the Renaissance stuff. So anybody working in that area, and like I was saying earlier, guys like Chaim Wierzbowski, who worked on translating the Hebrew and the Kabbalistic material in the Renaissance. I thought that was a really admirable work that, nobody reads it because you need to know Hebrew, Latin, Greek, and English, and presumably other Romance languages, because he doesn't translate as he's writing this book.
Right.
So it's like I saw people complaining that Francis Yates's Giordano Bruno in the Hermetic tradition does this.
Quotes in Latin. Yeah. I mean, my favorite history of the Copleston history of philosophy, which is my favorite, he just quotes in Latin and Greek. He's like, sorry. Like
I give both. But then it runs your word count up like crazy. And then people are like, why are your works so long? And it's like, well, like a quarter of this is doubled up text. It's, once in the footnote and once in the body paragraph. But
you have to, especially when it's turgid like that. You say, because that's the only way to really cover your ass, and to be like, no, I don't know what this is, and you don't either. Try, you do better. Yeah, and the Kabbalistic stuff is just, I don't know how much you've been reading, like often the Latin translations of Hebrew and Aramaic. That stuff is just a nightmare. Like reading some of the Sefer de Siniuta translated from Aramaic into Latin in the Cava Denudata, for instance. I'm like, you took an obscure text and made it even worse. Good job. This is like reading some continental philosophy from the 20th century or something. It's just a nightmare.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer. I don't have any like crazy translator people from the past necessarily. I mean, Ficino is one of them. I don't know if I admire Ficino. I mean, I am interested in Ficino and fascinated by him, and definitely he has a lot of wisdom, but there's a lot of things that I don't necessarily admire about him. So it's sort of hard to say that you would admire him as a person.
And he's just also interesting because he's in a period where like the professionalization of translation isn't a thing. That's a thing he does, but he's writing the Platonic theology. He's doing all kinds of other things. And it's just interesting that I don't know, standards for what made for good translations and stuff at the time were kind of not really set.
Yeah. And the word for it even was different, right? So they didn't call it translating, they called it interpreting.
Right.
And now it was translating essentially, but it also had a lot to do with understanding what you're reading and then being able to spit it out in reasonable in reasonable terms. I think of somebody who's admirable, Samuel Ibn Tibbon, who translated Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. Sometimes one word was used to translate 5 words, and sometimes 5 words were used to translate 1 word. Right. And apparently Maimonides himself was thrilled with the translation.
Yeah, Ibn Tibbon. I mean, it's funny because there are 2 Hebrew translations that were made. There's the Ibn Tibbon, and he translated everything. I mean, Ibn Tibbon, he was just sort of the guy. And Maimonides did like its translation, but there was another translation to Hebrew that's actually closer in many ways to, and I can't remember the translator's name now, but he rendered what is considered by scholars now to be a more faithful translation. Of course, the Ibn Tibbon version is the one that the one that sort of made it. I think he also translated Aristotle's meteorologic works and stuff as well. He's like a bunch of that stuff.
Samuel Ibn Tibbon wrote polemic against Raymond Marty's Pugio Fidei.
That makes sense.
Yeah. It's just like one of those things that I learned. I was like, interesting. Like he was, and then there, I mean, or was it was it the guy who went after Abulafia ibn Adret? Or
Over in Sicily?
yes.
Yeah.
Maybe it was him. I might be getting my guys
Yeah.
mixed up.
It could be. I mean, yeah. I mean, that was a pretty common. Chastai Crescas wrote refutations of stuff like that. I mean, it was a. I mean, it was. Yeah, there was. Again, there was sort of, that was a text that was a punching bag for Jews.
Yeah, it's just interesting because it clearly wasn't written to Jews. Like it was written for other Christians, and actually as like a preaching manual, and being like, they're going to bring up this argument, so you're going to hit them with this, and then they're going to talk about this, so you're going to hit them with the tetragrammaton, and then it's game over, right?
Yeah. It didn't really work for him though too well. It ended badly. That's what happens when you think you know how to do something, and then your best intentions hit the ground, and turns out swords don't really care about whether or not you're right or whatever. It didn't go so well for him. Another good question. I don't know if we'll be able to answer it, but from Tony, of all Arabic esoteric texts, which one do you recommend to be translated from the original Arabic language? One that's not translated yet.
The Shams, probably, which is being translated.
There's a chunk of it. Yeah, there's a chunk of it translated now. I have it. I haven't looked at it deeply, but
yeah, I mean that's what. So I worked on the Picatrix, but the Picatrix is certainly Arabic, but it's not Islamic. And so it's interesting to go and look at grimoires that are actually Islamic, in addition to being esoteric, if you will. And so that's definitely a good one. I think I'm really interested in the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. Yeah. And so I would really love to have that translated. I think it might be Underworks, but yeah, the pseudo, like the Kitab al-Istmakis.
No, right. That's where the Emerald Tablet and stuff is buried.
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff is
Ustuatas, I think it's called. And there's Istimakis, Istimatis. Those are two separate works. They all appear in parts of the Picatrix. Right. But I would love to get a copy of those original works and read them in their original form. Also, Maimonides says they're a bunch of nonsense, right? So we know that Maimonides read it alongside of the Nabatean Agriculture.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, I know that the chunks of the Nabatean of Agriculture are translated into that super expensive book.
Yeah, The Last Pagans of
Last Pagans. Yeah, it's like one of those crazy brill books or whatever that cost $1,000. Yeah, but yeah, the Nabatean Agriculture. I mean, it'd be great just to have a collection of that material, and sort of in the same way that the Latin Hermetica is coming out, to have a similar kind of sort of pagan adjacent Arabic, pagan adjacent Islamic texts.
What's interesting about the Nabatean Agriculture is that it's actually like Ibn Washia, who's compiling it from many other works. Well, it's got a very complicated textual history, but in brief, Ibn Washia is compiling it, and he himself is anti-magic. Right. And so, when you read about the Nabatean Agriculture in the Picatrix, let's say, you would get the impression that Ibn Washia is this like wizard who like knows all this stuff and is a practitioner and is recommending these various operations. That couldn't be further from the truth. He's very clear that he does not recommend magic, and he is simply passing along a kind of anthropological or ethnographical account to say, like, this is what the people used to do before the Arabs came. And like, this is the civilization of the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, and the
Sabians.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the Sabia. Yeah. There's a couple of super stickers that come through. Lewis, Michael, thank you very much for the super sticker. And NK, also big supporter of the channel. Thank you. Super stickers. I like what's like these. They're the various supers that have emerged. It sounds like it's like Power Rangers or something. And also, Liesel, thank you also for the super stickers. Keep the lights on. Keep the webcams running. Here's one I can answer really fast. Just Sirach, who I do like the Tomb of Horrors reference, is modern Hebrew really simply Aramaic? It is definitely not simply Aramaic. Modern Hebrew is closer to modern European languages, actually, in many ways, grammatically, and then actually than Semitic languages in a lot of ways. Modern Hebrew's Ben Yehuda is when he developed modern Hebrew, he was thinking a lot in German, and so a lot of the constructions are much more German-like, and of course the verb structure still, but yeah, it's definitely not Aramaic.
But same alphabet.
Same alphabet. Oh yeah.
Which is where the source of confusion would lie.
Right.
Same with Judeo-Arabic.
Right. Aramaic and Hebrew. I mean, lots of languages can be written in that alphabet, and lots and Hebrew can be written in alphabets that aren't that like Judeo-Arabic is a classic example, right? So and Yiddish is a Germanic language written in that alphabet. So yeah. And also Aramaic is written in a dozen alphabets. The Astrangela, the sort of Syriac alphabet, Mandaic is written. It's funny because if you take, like, I don't read the Mandaic alphabet very well, but if you just take Mandaic language and put it in Hebrew letters, it reads almost identically to the Aramaic of the Talmud. They're literally written in the same neighborhood, right? Asura and Pumbedita are sort of the main centers of the Babylonian Talmud. Just south of there is where the Mandeans are all living.
If you don't know, most people probably do know, but if you don't, when you see people talking about Chaldean as a language, they're talking about Aramaic. So like when you see Renaissance guys like Pico or whatever, and they're talking about Chaldean this and that, it's Aramaic that they're talking about.
Right. Yeah. So also Zen Dragons, thank you for the super chat. Very nice of y'all. I guess we got 15 more minutes, Dan. I don't have to go for a little while, but I don't want to take all your time. But let me jump off some and see if we can get some more questions before we go. All right. So the ever-present question, of course, we have to always answer the question about drugs. Either drugs or Dungeons and Dragons or something.
If they're there, I'll tell you. If they're not there,
yeah, I don't know about you, Dan, but this, I think I tend to be. I think I end up being deflationary just because I don't think they're there. Very, very.
They're there sometimes.
Sometimes, oh yeah, for sometimes. But I think that I don't know about you, that there's sort of this DMT reductionism that occurs. There's like the Venn diagram between people interested in esotericism and people interested in doing psychedelics is like can approach being a circle at times.
Yeah, myself included. But.
Yeah, ditto. I tend to be there, but it's one of those things where I think there's what I call the DMT reduction, right? Where it's like we can take everything in esotericism and reduce it down to some kind of psychoactive stuff. And I think that it's, I would say 95% of the time, I don't think there are substances involved.
I think that, there clearly were certain substances used all the time, but whether they became the centers of cults or things like that in the Middle Ages is another thing. So, we see psychoactive and psychedelic ingredients in recipes in various magical books. But whether, people used those in some sort of sacramental sense, in the style that some believe that the Eleusinian mysteries were practiced. So that's one of the ground zero questions, is the Eleusinian mysteries, and that's one where I don't know. I think that the ergot hypothesis is a decent one, but I also see poppies all over the there are remnants left behind with all kinds of artifact evidence that they were possibly using poppies or a mixture of something, or who knows, surrogates,
blue lotus or something.
Yeah, or I've done a lot of Blue Lotus. You're not getting much out of that.
Yeah, no, and also I think that's part of the ergotism thing that I'm more skeptical of. It's just that the kind of effects you get out of ergotism, from what we know of it, are more convulsant than psychedelic. And of course, it's also the precursor. It's a precursor drug, so maybe they're synthesizing it somehow in alcohol or something. That's
well, this is what Albert Hoffman talks about in The Road to Eleusis, is how he is reducing the parts that are abortifacient, reducing the parts that would make you like ill or miscarry or something like
Right.
that. And so, and he showed that you could actually do that by using certain bases like made with ash. And again, I trust that Albert Hoffman tested these things and found it to be psychoactive. I don't see why you can doubt that. But whether or not like that the whole cult was actually based around ergot, I honestly think that like it could be. My argument has long been that the state of ecstasy itself is more like people didn't distinguish how they got there in terms of like I could take 5 different plant substances and have weird experiences in each one, but I wouldn't necessarily like. I think we often mix it up with the idea of like plant spirits and things like that, which you get a lot in I think the Amazon today and like shamanism and things like that. But we don't have much of that in the Western tradition, at least not written. And I think the people who would be practicing this stuff probably wouldn't be the types to write it down anyways.
Right. That's what I suspect that as well, is that we, obviously art, whatever, lack of evidence isn't as an evidence of lack. So I think it's probably, it's probably there. And certainly the herbs and mushrooms are all grew in the European environment.
Yep.
But so I think it's possible. It's just one of those things where as academics have to say, the jury's out because we don't have evidence.
Like there's just clear evidence that that let's say Amanita muscaria was used in Europe, like period, because it's associated with the fairy circles and all the mythical creatures and all this and that. But whether there were specific religions that popped up around like the sacramental use of one plant, I think that is a more complicated situation.
Right. It's another interesting question I guess we can answer pretty easily. What translation of Proclus's Elements do you find more?
Thomas Taylor's.
That'll I have the Oxford one, whatever. I think it's it's funny because this is a question of the medieval one, but I have whatever the Oxford one is. It has that great essay at the end about astral vehicles. I'm gonna make an episode based on that essay at some point, but
yeah, honestly, when I read Proclus's Elements, I either read it in the original Greek from one of these Brill editions, or I read the Thomas Taylor because I'm just a big Thomas Taylor fan. That probably my next work will be something by Thomas Taylor.
Interesting.
On the Modern Hermeticist. I put off doing this Pico thing, and then finally I got that out of the way. So now I'm like, okay, well, it'll be long, but maybe I'll do the Thomas Taylor's dissertation on the Eleusinian mysteries. Oh. So we can actually, we'll have something on YouTube about the Eleusinian mysteries that is not my video on it or other people's videos on it. Nothing about psychedelics or anything like that. It'll just be purely Neoplatonic interpretation of the Eleusinian mysteries, which that is just as exciting as what you call the DMT. What is it? The DMT hole or the
DMT reductionism.
Yeah. So don't get me wrong. I love that stuff, but also I studied that stuff for a long time, and I found that there's a lot of people who claim there's stuff in places that there is not.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that there weren't those substances used, but just that it's not as common as people make it out to be.
Right. I think also another interesting discovery recently is the finding of cannabinoids at the Tel Arad shrine. I think that's a huge. I think that's really interesting and really important, and that they found it at least at one Yahweh shrine that we see the evidence of cannabinoids at that.
And also like resinous plants, right? Like you're just going to find in all braziers, you're going to find the remnants of all types of resinous plants.
Things have to burn. Yeah, they have to, they're going to, and there's a part of me that one of the things I wish they would have done is try to get the dimensions of the interior of the Tel Arad shrine, what the Holy of Holies would have been in terms of square meters, and then begin to think about sort of like based on the resins left, how much smoke is being produced in that tight area. Because then we can begin to get some, at least some extrapolation in terms of the relative psychoactive
Maybe that's what killed the priests.
Could have been. Well, the Jerusalem temple would have been massive. I mean, that would have been much, much bigger. But I mean, and also they weren't in there long when the incense was burning. So they would you would take it in, you would burn it, and you would get out of there. They weren't hanging out long in the Holy of Holies. I wouldn't want to hang out there long. I was going to say something else. Oh, I also say this. I think the Proclus's Elements of Theology is probably one of the most important works that has an impact on Western esotericism that just doesn't get read either by philosophy people or by people interested in sort of Western esotericism. I think it's one of these like decisively important works in Neoplatonic history, and I think that so much of what is downstream of what becomes Neoplatonism and stuff is really to be found in the Elements of Theology. I think it's super important. It's fun to read, sort of like reading ancient Spinoza.
Yeah.
Or
ancient Time Cube. That makes sense.
Yeah. I guess as much as you find Spinoza fun to read. I should speak for myself. All right. Let me get a couple more questions. Let's see. Do more in-depth stuff on other Gnostic sects like the one of Valentinianism? I probably will. Yeah, I probably will. The reason why there's a deep dive in Valentinianism is just the biggest and the most well attested. Most of these other sects we only know them from heresiological literature, and we only have tiny little things about them. So maybe I could do like a grab bag episode of like, here, the Borborites, the Carpocratians, and whatever. So we don't know so much about them.
Just do the nasty Gnostics.
The nasty Gnostics, the baby eating ones.
Yeah, just all the really
scandalous stuff.
Yeah,
just do all the super scandalous. That would be fun. Maybe there needs to be like a good chart of all the things that that sort of early Christians were accused of, and they transferred it to the Gnostics, and they transferred to the Cathars, and now it's in QAnon. Like we just need like the
history of the blood libel.
Yeah, the history of the blood libel, history of baby eating, the history of all the
psychic vampires.
Oh yeah, the whole all the things you can be accused of, and just see how they transfer through history. Because I think that's also a thing that people don't also understand about the Middle Ages. That is that medieval scholastic people really were looking at these like patristic books to make sense of their world, and in a lot of ways. And I think it's not unusual, but in a lot of ways, they just had to shove things into patristic categories. And so if they kind of looked sideways at it and squinted, it was like Manichaeism all of a sudden. And I think that it's really important to, when you read a lot of this medieval literature, that they're speaking patristics. And if you don't know the patristic literature very well, then you can often miss, you can take them literally in a way that that the categories they were using were pretty sloppy in a lot of ways.
Yeah, the church fathers gave the lens through which the medieval world perceived the world around them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Which is also, again, in the Middle Ages, like the Talmud. You have to really have some grasp of the Talmud to understand a lot of this is a thing that I often tell people about. They want to study the Zohar or medieval Kabbalah. I'm like, if you don't speak Bible at some level, it's really difficult to get inside of the Kabbalah. Because they wield that text and they wield medieval Jewish lore or Talmud and stuff so well that they just assume you know that and then go from there. And I think that this is also why people look at a text like the Zohar or something and there's like, I have no idea what's happening. It's like, yeah, they're talking they're just speaking a language, same with the Puritans and stuff, that if you don't have a really solid Bible education, it's not going to make a bunch of sense. It's a funny, Daniel Pellet often asks really great questions. Favorite journey to heaven and hell?
So my favorite anabasis or catabasis?
Yeah.
Good question.
I think this is a great question.
There are so many of them.
Aren't there?
I mean, Enoch is the classic.
Yeah, right. Enoch. It's a tie between Enoch and Dante, so we can't pick either one of those.
Yeah. And
easy.
Dante is probably realistically my favorite. And I think the Paradiso is horribly underrated.
Yeah. I love how Sigurd of Brabant is in the Paradiso. He's my favorite.
Joachim of Fior is too.
Yeah, Joachim of Fior. Yeah, of course. But the whole thing about who gets to be in heaven and hell. Again, that should also be a chart. Like who you would expect to be in heaven and who's not there, and who would you expect to be in hell, who is there.
Yeah.
Um,
But like, hell, circles of hell, whatever. That's not that cool. It's when you start getting into like who is in the sphere of the sun
yeah.
and why, and who is in the sphere. And, this is around the time that even people were starting to, there were even bits of Hebrew translations of Dante, and people were taking these Kabbalistic interpretations of Dante in the Renaissance where, the sphere of the sun is Tiferet.
Yep.
And that's where the saints go to live with God. And that's kind of like the highest point that you can go as an individual soul. And that's where Bonaventure and Dominic and Francis and Joachim of Fiore are all hanging out in the sphere of the sun. But yeah, this idea of the planetary ascent, sort of like Muhammad's night journey, like these are these hermetic motifs that survive into, let's say, mainstream Italian culture.
Yeah,
and we often obsess over, because we love, the demons and the tortures and the lustful getting banged about.
Yeah, it's like Gustave Doré that we love. We love it's like watching stills from a horror film. But yeah, I think the Paradiso is really terribly underrated, especially for understanding medieval cosmology and the values attached to that cosmology,
Mm-hmm.
which I
Definitely.
often. I would say that I think my favorite heaven and hell journeys, as much as they are heaven and hell, because Judaism doesn't often do that, is the Merkava texts. I really love how Baroque the Palaces of God is, and trying to sort of make a mental image or a mental map. I don't know if this is a Dungeons and Dragons reference for anyone who likes one. Do you play D&D at all, Dan?
Oh yeah.
Oh, so did you ever play Undermountain?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, so like Undermountain's like you could be in the dungeon the entire time, and you go from level to 1 to 20.
Whole campaign. I had whole campaigns in the Undermountain.
At least, yeah. Undermountain is like the king of all the dungeon crawls. I for whatever reason, I always imagine that the Merkava, the Hechalot, the palaces, are just Undermountain. It's just like the longest campaign ever. Then you're just going through all these, like encountering all. It's just, to me, it's just the most Dungeons and Dragons-y text. You have to like. It's like a saving throw, right? You come up to these angels and you have to like check against insanity, and then you have to tell them the password, and they'll let you by. It's just the most they're some of the most Dungeons and Dragons-y texts. I love that stuff. I should make this is why I need to have more time. I could make a whole campaign just Merkava based dungeon crawl.
Would you consider the orchard or the Garden of Nuts would you consider that an anabasis or a catabasis or?
Yeah. I've always had the sense. So, folks, this is a famous line from the Talmud, where you have the 4 people who descend into the Pardes, and some of them go crazy and some of them die. I always imagine that as being a cautionary tale, because one gets a sense that it's just the garden, and the garden's always outside of the actual dungeon. And there's this moment where when you see the wall of pure marble, don't say water, water. One gets the sense that that's just even like you're just kind of knocking on the door.
Yeah. Or the totem pass says don't drink from the stream on the left hand, but go to the right hand.
Right. Yeah. That I love that phrase also, Benzoma. And Benzoma went outside.
Yeah.
And he went crazy, and that was the end of it.
Is it he went outside or he stayed outside?
Yeah. So there's a moment where he's sitting on the steps of he's sitting somewhere, and his teacher comes by, and he doesn't stand up. And it's famously said, "Why didn't Benzoma stand up?" And he said, "He's still outside. Mm-hmm. He remains outside." And I love that. I mean, there's something really genuinely terrifying about that phrase. He remains outside.
There is, and I know people like that, and it's a sad thing to happen.
Yep. Yeah, and this is sort of going back to the drugs thing. That's where I really caution people about esotericism and psychedelic drug use. It's like those are both whammies on their own, and you can go outside and stay there. And I've definitely known those people.
You need a firm foundation of people to keep you rooted.
Right, and it's interesting that in the Merkava literature, they all go in groups. Mm-hmm. There's no. The descenders are always descenders. It's always like teams of people.
It's like when girls go to the bathroom.
It's true. Maybe they're just descending to the Merkava.
Yeah, they're powdering their nose, but they don't want to stay outside.
Yeah. It's like, what happened to Bonnie? She's still outside. Um, all right, Dan. Well, I think we're up to about an hour and a half, and I don't want to keep you any longer than that. But I know you're knee deep in dissertation. But when I'll ask you, do you want to? I hope you can do this again sometime.
Absolutely.
I think this is a lot of fun, and it's really great interacting with folks. And I don't know. I don't know about you. I can say that doing the kind of work we do can feel pretty isolating, and it can often feel like you're just sort of in a room by yourself talking to people who've been dead for 500 years or more.
That's why I'm here on the internet
Yeah.
doing what I do, because I know that, even my closest friends don't necessarily, either it's not that they don't care, it's that they haven't gone much of that way. And so there's not much to relate to.
Right.
It's hard to connect things with people who haven't done all of the legwork. So it's really great to, reach out and talk to people like you and Zevi and, people who have put in the work to have those points of connection that we can actually talk about, these broad subjects, but and have something fruitful out of it, instead of just like, oh, okay, that's cool. Like, that's kind of
Yeah. You study old stuff. That's neat.
yeah.
And it's also, I think, just a really cool thing we can do, it's a kind of public service, like, that this is stuff that we study really in depthly. And it's really great to be able to interact with folks for whom this is a spiritual path for them, or they're just curious, or they want recommendations. And
Cookie crumbs.
yeah, it's great. And people can be, they can kind of go off on their own and do these kinds of things. So it's just really I don't know, it's really fun to have a community and be building a community. And I think I'm interested in doing with some of these live streams, Dan, and I don't know if you'd be interested in it, is I'm increasingly interested in the not just doing the academic side of things, which obviously I'm going to continue doing in Esoterica. But one of the things I'd really like to use these live streams to do in the future as well is also to talk about the impact of this on our own philosophies and spiritualities, and do have a little bit more of a speculative or confessional space.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, I don't know about you, I don't think that exists anywhere.
I mean, that's what I had the podcast for. So I do all kinds of stuff on my YouTube channel, and I haven't done the podcast since I started my PhD program, because there's just too much stuff going on. But that was really my kind of place where I went to speculate and think of the grand scheme of things, and connect things to today. Like, these are all sins in the world of history. Right. Not supposed to connect to today. Not supposed to, like,
ditto. Same with philosophy, and that's even more bizarre to me. Is that somehow, when you're an academic philosopher, you just leave that stuff at some level. Like, you do exegesis and leave it. And I'm like, no, this has really. If any of this stuff is even remotely true, that is has profound implications.
Yeah.
On how we might live our lives, or what we might think about reality, and I feel like that's, I don't know.
Yeah. Like, I get having to feign objectivity.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, it's feigning objectivity. Nobody is objective.
Of course not. Yeah, of course not. And also, I think that, I don't know how you feel about this, but there's a kind of sense that I get this sometimes in the academic world, where if you do want to talk about the implications of this kind of stuff, it's looked down upon.
Yeah.
As if, like, you cross the streams, right? You I don't know. And I find that that's, I don't know, what's the right way of putting it? It's unfortunate. And that people who are more open about their own philosophical or spiritual beliefs often can be discounted. Their academic work is called into question because they might have an axe to grind. I just find that to be dreadfully unfortunate. And I don't know, I'd want to use a space like this to be able to, insofar as people are interested and willing to do that bigger picture thinking. So if you're interested in that, I'd love to have you back on to do some of that stuff.
I think there's, like, a time and a place for everything, and, like, certain, like, academia, for example, has to operate by certain rules in order to be productive in the way that it is productive.
Right.
But I think that academics themselves should not be, if they decide to, like, go outside of that realm of work or that kind of framework, and work in something else, they shouldn't be harangued for it. It's like you mentioned Elaine Pagels earlier. Elaine Pagels is a great example of a person who did great work on Gnostic scholarship, but is herself kind of a Gnostic, or part of an organization. At least she was. I don't know if she still is. That was purportedly Gnostic, and so that will, for some, bring their scholarship into question. But I feel like almost, you could have just as much of an opposite reaction. Like,
Of course.
how could you actually even know anything about the subject unless you were part of that religion?
Right, and this is the position that sort of, this, I'm sure, and other folks that don't know it. This is the big debate between Walter Hanegraaff and Versluis about this. That Hanegraaff is really, and I think this is less true now, but certainly when I was there studying with him, he was like, no, we have to. This entire field is barely existing anyway, and we cannot appear weird. So we need, we can study this stuff using the classical Vorwerk style historical, mechanism. And Versluis, I think, makes a compelling argument. Says no, that if we don't get the phenomenology of these texts, we're not getting them at all, because that's what they are. That these texts are at some level, the truth of them is in the doing of them. And there was, the people. It was funny because Versluis is here in Michigan. I've never met him for whatever reason, and they had a huge falling out, just personally, professionally.
Yeah,
really
I've read some of the literature that has. I think it was on Wouter Hanegraaff's blog.
Yeah.
But that was not just him. That was a few other of his colleagues that are disagreeing on a number of issues. Right. And it's this idea of religionism as a lens,
as a negative lens.
As a negative lens.
Slur, as a slur.
And I see that too, even on Twitter with certain scholars talking about how, and I mean, there are legitimate criticisms to be made here, but they complain that religious studies is dominated by confessionally motivated scholars. And I'm saying okay, so if you believe in something, you automatically don't get the right to talk about it. Only people who aren't invested in it have a right to talk about it. It's absurd.
It's absurd. Yeah. And I find that to be bizarre. And I think I think the implications of that are even worse for people with fringe beliefs. So if you're a Jesuit and you're studying, whatever Christianity, I don't think most people are going to blink an eye. I think that most people are like, yeah, of course, Jesuit. That's what they do. That's their whole shtick, right? But if you're a pagan studying paganism and you're an out pagan, you're going to get side eye. That's just a really foul double standard. And ditto, I think that people that I know who subscribe to a kind of Neoplatonism, who would be maybe even religiously describe themselves as in the tradition of Neoplatonism and pagan Neoplatonism, not Christian, Dionysius or whatever. Also, they just get the side eye in a way that if you're a card-carrying Deleuzian or something and believe some very Baroque, weird ontology, it's fashionable, so no one's going to side eye you.
Yeah.
But if you're like, no, I really believe in the great chain of being and blah, 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 people would. Yeah, I just, it's a double standard and stuff. It's just gross.
And then there's people like Thomas Taylor who were like, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyways.
Yeah.
And produce fantastic work, work that is somewhat a bit dated by today's rules and standards, but in general, as a believer in Neoplatonism, wrote fantastic interpretations of all kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that being a good scholar and being religiously motivated or confessionally motivated, those two things are logically distinct. I think that one could do both of those things badly, though. And I definitely know, I think both people could do both of them badly. And I'm much more interested, I think because it's, for me, I come from the philosophy background, and I think I'm one of the few people that I know of that come from a philosophy background doing Western esotericism. Almost all of them are either religious studies or history people. And I'm very interested in the philosophical implications of some of these belief systems. And I think that in philosophy, there's a weird conception that stuff from the past should stay there. And that just seems bizarre to me.
It assumes the battles were won.
Yeah, that we've moved on from Neoplatonism. That's sort of this it's like the crappiest version of Hegelianism. But it's no longer Hegelian in the sense that we have taken up all these ideas in the progress of ideas. It's just we've abandoned everything from the past, and now we're like logical positivist, and we're done. I don't know. That's just, it's like crappiest philosophical way of methodology, or the analytic philosophy just pretends that the history of philosophy didn't happen.
Or it's all logic.
Yeah, it's
all of philosophy is logic.
Yeah. And it's funny because a lot of these analytic philosophers now are in a situation where they're coming to conclusions, and people are like, yeah, Plotinus said that. the equivocation of being. Yeah, we had that discussion actually in the 13th century. Because they have no history background, they don't realize they're reinventing the wheel or something, which is just
Yeah.
At any rate, that's an idea for another day, just to begin to have those kinds of conversations. And I think I would just be interested in that, and I'm glad you might be interested in it as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because it's one thing to talk about history, which is my day job and my passion, but then philosophy is another one of those things. I don't do it formally, but I do spend a lot of time in philosophy thinking about this stuff. So definitely I'm interested in that.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Dan, I really appreciate you coming on. I'm glad we finally made this happen. I finally broke down, and I was so intimidated by all the software that I put off doing it, but I've been threatening to do it for a while. But I'm so glad that I did it, because I get to hang out with you, man, and I really appreciate taking the time to hang out, and I look forward to doing it again.
Yeah, thanks. I also look forward to doing it again, and hopefully it's not in the too distant future.
Hopefully not. All right, folks. So I just want to say also thank you, everyone, for the super chats and just the kind comments and the great questions. Just really, really happy to have just such a great community around Esoterica that's come up around Esoterica, and you guys really make it worth it. So thank you so much for supporting the channel and leaving such great comments and such great questions. And I'll be back again next week on just an exclusively Esoterica live stream, I think. Maybe next week, but other than that, I think there's a new cool episode coming on Friday about all the other Galilean miracle workers that weren't Jesus. Jesus was one of a crowd, so we'll talk about some of those guys on Friday. But until then, everyone take care, and I'll see you around.